All right, just had to start the recording there. Alrighty. So today we are going to talk about other training class opportunities that are coming up. Also going to highlight the Alteryx community, which is a great place to ask and answer questions. We're going to go through two use cases with a fictitious client, Office Supplies Incorporated. They have two different use cases that we're going to walk through and build out a solution to, utilizing two different ways that you can use the dynamic input tool. And then I'm also going to point out some support resources that you can refer to if you have other questions or need additional training or learning opportunities. So there are additional training courses that you can choose to sign up for and take. We can see we're here on the dynamic inputs. Next week we have enriching data sets, and then one with parsing, as well as a variety of other training options that you can see there. I'd like to take a second to point out the Alteryx community, community.alteryx.com. You can see the address up in the upper right-hand corner of the page there. It's a great place to go interact with fellow Alteryx users, post questions, get answers from other users, including Alteryx employees and ACEs or experts in the tool, and also to submit ideas of how to improve the product. We have a badging system where you can earn reputation and rewards for your contributions to the community. You can share your knowledge. We also have a series of blog posts, macros, and other insightful documents like tips and tricks that are posted out on the community. It's a great resource to improve your knowledge of Alteryx and how you can take it further. In our presentation today, we're going to go through two use cases. The first use case is that Office Supplies, Inc. wants to produce a sales summary report by category and subcategory on a 3-month rolling basis, so that every time that the workflow is ran, that it pulls 3 months from the current date or the date in which it was ran. And they want this to be done in a way that doesn't require the user to manually change date inputs or filters. The second use case is that they want to identify how many competitive stores are within 20 miles of each of their 10 locations. And the challenge here is that they have that data for their different competitors stored in different tabs of an Excel document, and that document could grow over time. And so they want the ability to read in all of them at the same time and make it dynamic so that if they did have more competitive tabs added to that document, that when it was ran, it would pick up those documents as well. So the key concept we're covering in this is the dynamic input tool. The dynamic input tool can be used in two distinct ways. The first is modifying an SQL query. Using the dynamic input tool, you can alter existing SQL code on the fly so that the data that it's being pulled is dynamically based off of some process upstream in the workflow. We're going to show you an example of how to build that out and how it works. Secondly, the other way that it can be used is to read in multiple files or tables of data within a single file, in the case of Excel, that have identical structure. So you can feed a list of files into it. It will read each of them and automatically stack or union that data together, given that they have the same structure. And now we're going to jump to Alteryx. Right. So I'm in the Alteryx designer here, and I'm going to go ahead and start with our first use case, the using a dynamic input to pull a 3-month rolling set of dates. So the first thing we're going to do in this is we're going to create the process upstream of our data input that's going to tell us or give us the 3-month range that we want to use. So to do that, the first thing we're going to do is go into the input and output section, and we're going to grab a date time now tool. The output of this is going to be the current date and time, and we can choose the format of that date and time in the configuration panel here. So I'm going to make this match the format that SQL typically uses and that Alteryx uses for a date. This top one here, 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day. This is going to give us a string or text output of what the current date is at the time of run. So we can see that the output down in the output window here is today's date. We're now going to convert this because you can see that it's a string. If we didn't know that it was a string ahead of time, we could drop a select tool in there and see it does produce a string field. We want to convert that to an actual date so that we can use it in a calculation. So I'm going to show the date time conversion tool here to do that. And so I'm going to take that string input field, convert it to an actual date time field, and we're going to select the format that matches the format we just selected in the tool before, in the date time now tool. And that's going to output a date time field here, and I want to rename that to my end date. So in my query, that's going to be the last date that I want to pull. Okay, now we have two dates here. We have the current date, that same date, but if we look at them, their structure, this one is a string, and this one is actually a date field. And now we're going to calculate. We want to calculate 3 months back. So we want to find our start date. So we'll go in here, grab a formula tool from the preparation category, drop it into our workflow. I'm going to create a new field that I'm going to call start date, and it's going to be the date output. Sorry, this is going to be a string output because it's going to need to be a string to go into our query. And then we're going to build out the expression. So we're going to go into our functions tab here, and we're going to go into date time functions. There's a list of date time functions here. The one we're going to want to use is date time add a specific interval to a date time. Okay, and in the example here, you can see we're taking a date field and we're going to add -3 days to that, which would be subtracting. So we're going to move backwards in time. So even though it's called a date time add, we can also use it to work backwards. So I'm going to drop that into my expression builder by double-clicking. Go back to my variables, I want to take that end date and I want to change the interval to -3. So I'm going to go back 3 months. So I'm going to type in the word months, and we're going to put that in quotes because it is a string that the expression is going to go find months and be able to move back to that exact date 3 months ago. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and run this to make sure that we got what we were looking for here. So we can see we have our data now in the correct format. All right, and because I only want this to be the same format as this one is here, we can fix that by setting this length to 10, a character length of 10, which will go ahead and get our start date to be in the exact same format as our end date there. Question pops up, what if you need it to be relative to the last date in a data set rather than today? Could you do that? Sure. Instead of starting with this date time now tool, I would have to run a query to find the last date or the max date, and as the input, I would use that, do the same process here, and then be able to feed it into the dynamic input tool, which is what we'll do next. Okay. All right, so now I've identified my start date and end date, the 2 dates I'm going to use for my query. And now I'm going to go ahead and bring out the dynamic input tool that we're going to use. Now, because this is accessing a database, I was not able to send this data over to you to have run in a database, obviously, because then you would have to load it into a database to use it. So you're just going to have to watch along with this, or use a database that you already have that has a date in it that you can try this out with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead into the developer category. You can also get to this tool by typing in the search here. If I type in dynamic, we can see the dynamic input tool here. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that into my workflow. In the dynamic input tool, I'm going to have to go ahead and configure my query as normal. So I'm going to go ahead and go out to my database connection here. I have a local SQL server installed on my machine, so I'll go select that. And I'm going to go over to the SQL editor here, and I'm actually just going to copy and paste in some code that I already have existing. So I'm just going to paste that into here. And we can see that we're pulling data from a table here, and we've got a where clause right here that is pulling dates between these 2 dates. Okay, and so right now this is just set through pull data from 2015 through the beginning of 2016. Okay, so we're initializing our query. Now that we have the query set up here, now we can use the dynamic input tool to dynamically edit this query. So I'm going to click on the second option here that says Modify SQL Query. And I'm going to click Add. And I want to replace a specific string. And so this is going to take the text of the query that we just created and drop it into here. So I want to replace this first date here, so my starting date. I'm going to go ahead and replace that. So I'm going to delete everything except for just that. And I want to replace it with my start date. So I'm telling it what's the date that I want to replace it with. So it's going to go through that query and update the kind of preceded code that I put in there with whatever the start date is that we just calculated in the formula tool before it. And then I also want to do the same thing and replace the ending date. So I'm going to go in here, replace a specific string. I'm going to go over and delete everything except for my ending date. And I'm going to select the end date here. Okay, so we can see now in the dynamic input tool, we've specified a query. We've specified how we want to modify that query with data upstream from it. And now when we execute this query, we're going to get data, and we can see the dates start with 3 months ago today and go through our current data here. Okay. And it looks like that didn't exactly work the way that I wanted it to. There we go. Sorry, I grabbed the wrong date. That didn't look like that worked either. All right, I apologize there. I went ahead and fixed that there real quickly. So we've got our start date and end date that we're fixing that from. And we've got our data. Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and summarize this data. So we go back to the original process. We wanted to summarize this to a product category and a product subcategory level. So I'm going to go back to my transform category, grab a summarize tool. I want to summarize this to a product category level and a subcategory level. And I'm going to go ahead and sum up the sales and sum up the number of total units that we would want to use for this calculation. So numeric sum, and we have a quantity here that we will sum up. We're going to name this sales. Okay, and then we run this, and we've got our now totaled sales and units by product category and product subcategory using a dynamic input tool to modify an existing query to be able to pull 3 months of rolling data. So if we came back and ran this again tomorrow, we would have a different start and end date for our data here. Any questions on using the dynamic input to modify a SQL query before we go to our second use case? All right. We'll go ahead and jump to our second use case. So our second use case is going to be highlighting using the dynamic input tool to pull in multiple tabs of an Excel file. So you should have been sent the data for this second portion here. So we're going to start with a store file for our 10 stores for Office Supplies Inc. that we're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and grab an input data tool, and I'm going to browse out to that location. And grab that file and read it in. Okay, so we've got these 10 locations. And then we're going to bring in our competitive information, so the stores that we determine our competitors. And so we're going to pull in this store locations file. And we can see that this has several different tabs to it. There are quite a few. And for this, we're actually just going to say, let's grab the list of sheet names, and we're going to use that to dynamically read them all in at the same time using a dynamic input tool. So you can see the output of this is just the list of sheet names. And now we're going to bring in our dynamic input tool. I'm going to go ahead and search for it again here. Dynamic input. If this was a tool you were going to use very commonly, remember you can always place it on your favorites by clicking the star in the upper right-hand corner of any tool, and it'll appear on your favorites palette. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that, drop it in here, and connect it to the stores locations file. There was a question about the previous one when you were connecting or you were doing the query with the dynamic SQL. Would that actually execute the filtering in that example on the database, or would it execute it within Alteryx? It would execute it on the database because it's actually part of the query. Sorry to step back there. I just didn't notice the question ahead of time. So getting back to our example here, we've got a list of tab names that we want to read in from this Excel document. Now we need to tell it how we're going to use the dynamic input tool to do that. So again, we're going to start with setting up the data source template. And so in this case, this is going to be a file. And it's actually this file right here that's my recent, the one I just selected. So I could grab it there. Or I can go out to File Browse and go to the location. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick one of them as my template. Remember, this is a template source. Okay, so I'll grab one of them there. And I'll go ahead and hit OK. And then in the options on the dynamic input tool, we can read a list of data sources. And so we're going to change the field here to the list of sheet names. Okay. And then there's an action here that we can do. This depends on the list that you're feeding it. So, if you had that was going to be a suffix or a prefix to a file or a table name, you could use that. In this case, since it's Excel, we're going to change the table name, which is the default option. But if you did have the entire path name of each of the files you wanted to read in, you could use the change entire file path option as well. We're going to leave it right here on the change file table name. Table and tab are the same thing in Excel. Okay. And I'll go ahead and drop a browse out here on this one so we can see what that does. So when we execute this workflow, we can see down here in my results window, and I'm just expand this for a second, our input data tool read in the data from our customer sheets, then it read in the list of file names from here, and then the dynamic input tool read in all of these different tabs that were the list of sheet names that we got from here, read in each of them. And then if we look at the browse, we can see that that is automatically union together on each of these. So we can see all of that data. Now, in order for this to work, just a reminder, the data does have to be formatted identically between the different tabs. So if you had different data types in one of the columns, or if the column names were different between the two of them, you would not be able to use the dynamic input in this way. Okay. So now we do have a list of our existing stores for our fictitious customer here, our client, and we have a list of their competitive stores that they want to identify how many of them are near, how many of these stores are near each of these ones. So first thing to do that, we're going to do a little bit of spatial analysis, but to do that we're going to need to do some geocoding. If you do not have the data package for this, you may not be able to do the geocoding, but you were able to follow along hopefully with the dynamic input portion of this. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a street geocoder on here because I want to geocode this data by the address, city, state, and zip code. And I'm going to go ahead and clear out these pieces, and I only really want this spatial object. And for the purposes of this, I'm just going to tell it to return the first candidate or the one with the best match. I need to geocode this information also, but we can see I already have a latitude and longitude that we got from this data. So I'm going to use a different method of geocoding for those. I'm going to go ahead and grab a create points tool and drop it in there. And this is going to create a point based off of longitude and latitude. Okay, we'll drop some browsers after these and run my geocoding for each of these. Give it a base map here, so we can see it's going to go ahead and plot those. All of these stores are in the Denver metro area. And then we've got this other base map out here. You can see these stores are all over the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii that they had these lists for. So we're going to configure then a tool to find which of these stores are near, which of these competitive stores are near the stores for our Office Supplies, Inc. We're going to do that using the Find Nearest tool. So I'm going to drop this onto the canvas here. A tip that I always like to use is if we drop on this, it's going to kind of give you a list or a description here. So identify the closest points or polygons in one file to the points in the second file. So it describes kind of how that's used there. So we want to find which of these are close to the points in the second file in the way that you would describe that. So our target in this case is going to be coming from these locations. You configure this by selecting the spatial objects, and they're the only two spatial objects within there. And then we want to kind of give it a limit here. We don't want a reasonable distance that we would call it a competitive store. It has a default in there of about 20 miles. I think that's okay. So we'll go ahead and leave that. And we're just going to find the one nearest store to each of them so that each of these will only be considered a competitor for one of each of these. But you could up that number if you wanted to include the possibility of overlap between them. And so I'll drop a browse out here and run this. And it's going to chug through that. And we find that of the 6,399 stores that we had, we get about 108 of them are within 20 miles of one of these stores. And we can see in the base map here, each of the green dots represents a store from Office Supplies, Inc., and the red dots represent a competitive store that's near each of those. And then I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick summarize in here and say, how many stores are within range of each of them. So I'm going to configure that with a group by on my store ID. So I have one line per store. Maybe I also want to know what types of stores they are near them. So I'm going to go ahead and go to company and do a group by on that as well so that I know how many Walmarts and how many Targets are near each of these in this case. And then I'm going to do a count on that. Now, a count function in the summarize tool is going to count the number of rows regardless of which field you pick. So if I pick count here, it doesn't really matter which field I select. Now, if I wanted to do count distinct, count non-null, count null, any of those, I would need to tell it an appropriate column to count on. But if I'm just counting the number of rows, it doesn't matter which field you choose to count on. And so I'll go ahead and run that one more time, and we can quickly see that store number 100 has 3 targets and 10 Walmarts within a 20-mile radius of it, and so on and so forth for each of these. So in this example, we learned how to take the dynamic input tool and use it to read in multiple tabs of an Excel spreadsheet. You could use it to read in multiple files, multiple tabs, but remember they do have to be formatted in data type and column names identically. Any questions on this set here? So a question came about find nearest. Could we find the one closest Target or the one closest Walmart or the one closest Kmart to each store? You would have to reverse the way that you had these inputs so that you were finding only one match to one store, as opposed to finding, in this case, we're finding for each competitive store, finding the closest of Office Supply Inc. stores, and then you would have to reverse those so it would find exactly one store next to it, and you would have to do them separately. In this case, there is not a group by function in the Find Nearest tool, so you'd have to filter the data to Walmart's, find the closest, filter the data to Target's, find the closest, filter the data to Kmart's, and find the closest for each of them. But yeah, you could do that. Any other questions about any of the tools used here, or any specifically about the dynamic input tool? A great question was asked, are there any advantages to using the dynamic input to read in a list of things versus using a wildcard in your input data tool? So if I were reading in, let's say, in this case, I think there's 10 tabs. If I was reading in 10 different Excel files that were all had the data in sheet 1, and I wanted to, and they were all formatted the same, I could do that using a wildcard tool, or if they were CSV files or something else. The advantage here is that it actually allows you to feed any list into it, not just a wildcard on the name of the file. So I could read in multiple tabs within one file, which is what we're doing here. If you had, let's say, multiple tabs on multiple files, you could also set that up and take a few extra steps to find the tab names on all of the different files, but you could definitely bring all of those in. Great question here as well. This only works if they're formatted identically, and is there a workaround for reading in files that have slightly different formats? So maybe they have extra columns in there that you don't really care about. You only want kind of what matches mutually. Great question. There is a workaround for that, and it would be using what's called a batch macro. So in a batch macro, it would be a very, very simple batch macro where you just had an input data tool that was what you were changing, and then you would use a control parameter that would be feeding a list of file names. It is, in that case, it would, it doesn't have to be identically structured because it is reading them slightly differently, or reading the files using an input data tool as opposed to a dynamic input tool. And there is some documentation on our website about using batch macros that you could go to. It would be a very, very easy batch macro to create. So there is a question about using some input names within a second file within an app that's pretty specific to this. I will follow up with you kind of separately on that since it's not exactly related to what we have here. Yeah, so this says, could you use this to pull in the first sheet name in an Excel file regardless of what it is named? You can see in this here, I never specified the name of the sheet. I used an input tool to grab the name of the sheet. That's really only an option for XLSX. If it is a CSV file or a different file type, this option of list of sheet names is not available there. There are some kind of workarounds that you could use something else like Visual Basic or something to find the name of the sheet name. But yeah, most of the time you would have to know the sheet names if it's not an XLSX document. Yeah, so someone asked, can I explain what each of the four connectors on this Find Nearest tool is? So the T stands for target input. So this is for each of these targets, I want to perform the operation. U is the universe of options which it could find the nearest to. If you think about that, it's for each one of these, I want to find the nearest from this list. And this list is going to get used repeatedly. So that's what the difference between the target and the universe. These are used once. These are used repeatedly. And then the M is what matched. The U is what was unmatched. And if you click on the actual anchors, you can see kind of the name of them. Gives you a little bit of insight around that. The T is the targets that we have here. The U is the universe that you see the matching name there. You can also see it down in the results here. M is what matched, and U is what unmatched. All right, we're going to jump back over to the PowerPoint and go over some resources at this point. Some additional resources that you can go to. First off, the community is a great place to go and search for questions that you have. You can post questions. You can search questions similar to yours and see if someone else has already answered them, which is oftentimes the case. We do have a set of training resources, www.alteryx.com/product training. There are a series of short videos. The basic ones usually ranging between 3 and 5 minutes. Some of the advanced ones between 6 and 12 minutes in length that cover specific topics. And If you do need additional technical support, please email clientservices@alteryx.com. We do have a great click to chat on alteryx.com/support that I always hear great feedback about, so that would be something I would highly suggest that you do. And then there's a phone number for the technical support there as well. After you leave the webinar here, you will be directed to a survey. Please go ahead and fill that out and let us know how we did so that we can make sure that we give you better training in the future. So thank you all very much for joining the webinar, and thank you very much for all of your questions. We greatly appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.